Hey there, folks. It is a beautiful summer evening. I am sitting outside under a shade tree at our own Scottsburg High School while I wait for my son to finish tennis practice. And so I've been looking and working on this George Washington presentation. And so I thought, hey, what a perfect time to record it. So if you hear some outdoor sounds, it's because I'm outdoors. But we're going to spend a little bit of this week looking at our first five presidents. They are our founding father era presidents, these guys with a direct connection to each other, to the Revolutionary War, and these guys are some of the heavy hitters in the early part of American history. The first guy we're going to look at is George Washington. George Washington, by any and all accounts, is one of the best presidents, if not the best president, that our nation's ever had. And we're going to look at his life and his legacy as President of the United States. So I got Hamilton on my mind as I'm recording this, and so there's a famous song, "Here Comes the General." So we'll get to "Here Comes the General," but before then, let's talk about him as a young man. He was from the state of Virginia. His father died when George was just 11 years old, leaving him with an inheritance. He became a landowner, but also the owner of 10 slaves that his father had owned. And we already saw in that article on Founding Fathers and Slavery that slavery is a complicated part of the Washington legacy. But just from a young age, he had to be there for his family. He had an older half brother who was also there as well, but just trying to make his way in the world. Wasn't a stellar student in the way that Thomas Jefferson was. Very capable, but lacked some of the flair in the academic life, you might say, in there. He was a surveyor, which meant he went out and surveyed property. He trained as a surveyor, but he joined the British military and may have actually started the French and Indian War. Depending on the story you hear, there was a fort out west, and by west I mean kind of the Kentucky area, where he, as a member of the British military, comes out. The French are there. He has a numerical advantage, and so he decides to attack with his troops and a group of Native Americans that he's got with him. They beat the French, but the French tell the story that they had actually assurance from Britain that they weren't going to be attacked. George Washington says he didn't know anything about this, but the incident actually sets off aggression into what would be the French and Indian War. So he may have actually caused that. He was, in his personal life, marries a young lady named Martha Custis. She was a widow at 27. Wealthy widow, and so he married very well. But she was, by all accounts, a great lady too. She had a couple of children from her previous marriage, but she and Washington were never able to have children together, and so he raised those kids as his own. But like I said, never had any biological children. This is his eventual home. His brother Lawrence got the land that would be Mount Vernon in after his father's death. Well, when Lawrence died, he bought the estate from his sister-in-law and then proceeded to build it up into a fairly large estate. Looking today, with just the property he owned, he owned a whiskey distillery there, obviously agriculture, things like that. He didn't grow tobacco like a lot of people in the South. He concentrated on wheat. Um, but some estimates I was seeing were that he would have been worth, kind of Mount Vernon, he would have been personally worth around $600 million in today's money. So a very wealthy fella. Mount Vernon is open to the public today. It's outside of Washington, D.C. It is a beautiful place, amazing museums and history that are there. If you ever get a chance, it's a cool one to go visit. I'm actually going to put a slide up on the playlist, or a video up on the playlist that just gives you a view of Mount Vernon, because it's just a neat place to go and visit. He is critical of the British rule of the taxation without representation and those sorts of things during the lead up to the Revolutionary War. And so when he goes to the First Continental Congress, he is the choice for commander-in-chief of the colonial military. And so he's voted to be in charge. He had military experience. He was known to be very level-headed, wasn't somebody that got very emotional, and his humility also really impressed people. As a general, he gets kind of a bad rap, one that I think I might argue is undeserved, just because he never really had superior forces. His guys weren't as well trained. He didn't have just really a whole lot going for him. But he keeps this ragtag army together just basically by the sheer force of his own personality. So when I say the odds are never in your favor, right, it's a little play off of the Hunger Games. But you can really argue that he didn't have to win the Revolutionary War. He had to not lose the Revolutionary War. And so that's what that's really what he had to do, was to hold off, to fight the British enough that they were willing to give up. And after the 8-year Revolutionary War, they eventually do that. Interesting thing, in 1782, so about a year before the war ends, he has a group of troops, and the Continental Congress had trouble paying the troops. It was always kind of a source of frustration. And he actually has a group of soldiers write him a letter, and it becomes known as the Nicola letter in history from the guy that wrote it. Basically, this guy looks at him or writes him this letter and says, "Hey, General, think you're great. All those guys were talking and think that we would like for you to be king, because we know you would take care of the military." Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody wrote me a letter and said, "Hey, we think you ought to be king," I think I would be flattered. George Washington was flabbergasted. He basically looked and said, "I don't know what it is in my character that makes you think that I think this would be a good idea, but there's nothing more dangerous to what we're fighting for than this idea of being a king." And he basically closes the note by saying, "Look, you just don't ever need to tell anybody else this idea, or I'm going to have you thrown in jail." And so, not quite the way, but it just gives you an idea of his character, the type of guy that he was. That he wasn't looking for that type of accolade, wasn't looking for the role as king. Very famously leads his troops through a winter at Valley Forge. Valley Forge is just north of Philadelphia. It's an extremely cold winter. They didn't have a whole lot of supplies. A lot of times in the Revolutionary War, you didn't fight during the winter because it was hard to move things on roads. So it's just kind of survival mode. He brings over a guy to help train his troops to try and come out stronger at the end of the war, or at the end of the winter than they went in. And really, it's his faith. This painting is George Washington praying at Valley Forge. Behind him, you'll see his horse Nelson, very famous white horse. George Washington was supposed to be an amazing horseman. Thomas Jefferson wrote about how he was just poetry in motion on horseback, and so he ends up kind of holding the group together there, and making sure that the colonial army stuck it out. After the war, he left. He was, like I said, extremely popular with the troops. Heck, they're wanting him to be king. And for a lot of people, that was kind of the expectation, that George Washington, as head of the army, might just say now, "You know what? I'm the guy in charge." Instead, he resigns his commission. And so when it says "I'm out," I'm paraphrasing, but he basically writes a letter to his troops. "Thanks, fellas. I appreciate what you've done. Now let's go build this republic together. Let's see this thing through that we started, and really see what's going on." People were shocked. He starts to get compared to a guy named Cincinnatus, and this statue is of George Washington. It's in the Smithsonian, and it's an amazing statue. As you can tell, it is in the style of kind of a Greek statue from back in the day. and that is intentional. Cincinnatus was a Roman leader who also did the same thing. He led the army, um, got things done that needed to be done, took care of the threat, but he laid down power. And so when Washington did that, he becomes kind of an American Cincinnatus, and that's what this statue is referring to. I'm pretty sure that if George Washington ever saw this statue, he might be a little uncomfortable with the idea of having his shirt off. But if he was cut like this, right, he could be in a Marvel movie and be president. So problem is he retires, goes back to Mount Vernon, but he's going to get called back in. So here's a little 6-minute or 6-second clip from The Godfather Part 3, which is in the film library.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
All right, I'm going to go back and play that again because I don't know if you could hear it.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. Here comes the president, right? So we've had here comes the colonel, here comes the general, now here comes the president. There are some concerning events in the era of the Articles of Confederation. Probably most seriously something called Shays' Rebellion, where a rebellion in the northeast of the country against taxes threatened the very fabric of American society. And so Washington and some of the other founding fathers start to look and say, hey, maybe these Articles of Confederation aren't going to work out. And so they meet in Philadelphia with the purpose of redoing the Articles, but as we've already talked about, they chuck them pretty quickly. People from his native state of Virginia, James Madison being one of them, have the Virginia Plan, where they have a brand new idea for a strong federal government, which Washington really liked. And like I told you before, basically everybody in the room, as they're discussing Article 2, knows that George Washington is going to be the first president of the United States. He understood his role as president was to set precedent for everybody that was going to come after him. He, for instance, told people he wanted to be called Mr. President. They had a lot of really high and mighty titles they wanted to give. He said, no, Mr. President will do nicely. He's going to serve 2 terms, which is a tradition everybody follows until FDR in World War II. He didn't like to shake hands. He thought that was beneath the presidency, but he would bow to you when he met you. And so he really kind of establishes what the presidency is going to look like. He's got an all-star cabinet. Thomas Jefferson works for him. John Adams is his vice president. Very famously, of course, from the musical, Alexander Hamilton is his Secretary of the Treasury. And he basically tells Hamilton to do what he needs to do to put the country on firm financial footing. And so he and Hamilton had been together in the Revolutionary War, continued to be very tight. And so as Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson start to get into it, it makes things a little awkward for everybody in those cabinet meetings. Washington also keeps us out of a war that was brewing between Britain and France. France wanted us to join in on their side. Washington didn't want to fight Britain, so he ends up sending John Jay, who was his Secretary of State, first Secretary of State, over to make a treaty with the British. The French weren't very happy with it, but Washington kept our young country out of war. Now, the song in Hamilton, to go back to that musical, it's on the Disney Plus. If you haven't seen it, it's excellent. One Last Time, where he tells Alexander Hamilton where he's going to give the nation a lesson in saying goodbye. And so George Washington will retire to Mount Vernon. But like I said, his example is one that everybody else kind of followed. When you're doing top 10 list of presidents or ranking the presidents, he is at or near the top of every one of those lists. Just a phenomenal guy. People continue to be impressed with his willingness to lay down power. We really owe the country we live in today to his willingness to do that. Sadly, he doesn't have a very long post presidency. He ends up catching a very bad cold. He's out in kind of some rough weather and that kind of stuff, and ends up catching a cold. He has the caretaker at Mount Vernon bleed him, thinking that taking a pint of his blood using leeches was going to help. It really doesn't. They call doctors in, and they can't do anything for him, and they figure out he's going to die. He was 67, apparently pretty chill about it. When he died in his own bed there at Mount Vernon. Again, if you get a chance to go, you can see that bed. But was very much at peace with it. That he was going. He was a man of faith, and I think knew he'd run a good race, as it were. And so he is. He dies in 1799. He's buried at Mount Vernon. I mentioned there was actually talk of bringing his body to Washington, D.C. to bury him at the Capitol, but for a variety of different reasons that didn't happen. So if you go to Mount Vernon, he and Martha are buried there together, in that place. So just an amazing guy, somebody I would really encourage you to learn a little bit more about. One of my favorite stories of Washington as president was during what was called the Whiskey Rebellion. They were trying to pay some bills, and so they said, well, hey, we're going to put a tax on whiskey, and the people got tore up and said, no, we're not going to do that. And so there was an armed group that got together, and they were going to fight. They had horses and guns and the whole 9 yards. And so Washington wanted to raise an army, couldn't get permission to use the National Army, so he raised the militia and led them out onto the battlefield. So he is our only president ever in history to lead an army onto a battlefield. And when they saw George Washington coming, the guys doing the Whiskey Rebellion just kind of gave up. They're like, I'm out. Right, this isn't what we're going to do in this situation. So, like I said, kind of a cool guy. He'll pop back up from time to time as we're talking, especially as we get into talking about in depth about the Revolutionary War. So, like I said, hope you enjoyed that, and we'll be back with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. We're going to go two at a time for the next two sets.